The wind, a relentless sculptor of the high plains, whipped Ilara's threadbare shawl around her, stinging her raw cheeks with particles of ice-laden dust. Each gust felt like a personal assault, tearing at the last vestiges of warmth that clung to her worn frame. Below the scarred, bruised knuckles of her clenched hands, the ground was a relentless canvas of frozen, cracked earth, mirroring the landscape of her heart. 3 weeks. 3 weeks since the fever had claimed Thomas, leaving her with a stack of unpaid debts and a small, forlorn homestead that the bank had swallowed whole before his grave mound had fully settled. She was adrift, a lone, stark figure against an unforgiving horizon, her world reduced to the pack on her back and the memory of a love now a searing ache. The biting cold was not just outside, but seeped into her bones, a constant reminder of her utter desolation. Her gaze, red-rimmed and weary, swept across the desolate expanse, a vast, indifferent ocean of pale grasses and stark, skeletal trees. There was no solace here, only endless, crushing space. Hunger gnawed at her belly, a persistent, dull ache that had become a familiar companion. She hadn't eaten a full meal in days, rationing the last piece of dried jerky until it had vanished like her hopes. Her boots, thin and split, offered scant protection against the frozen ground, and each step was a testament to a dwindling will, a silent prayer for something to give, anything to break the relentless march towards oblivion. Her breath plumed in ragged clouds, disappearing into the vast, indifferent sky, each exhalation feeling like a fragment of her spirit escaping. She recalled the last words spoken to her by the town's banker, a man whose face was as pinched and narrow as his ledgers. "No husband, no land, no prospects, woman. You be wise to move on. There's nothing for you here." His words had carried the weight of a final judgment, echoing the collective sentiment of a community that saw a widow as little more than a burden, a woman alone a dangerous anomaly. But where to move? Where was Lon? The world stretched out, a boundless, hostile entity, with no place for a woman of her means, her strength, her quiet despair. She possessed no delicate arts, no marketable skills beyond the raw endurance of a life spent beside a farmer who had loved her, only to be taken too soon. Her hands, though calloused and strong, were not for embroidery, they were for turning soil, for milking cows, for hauling water. These were the hands of a worker, not a supplicant. A faint, almost imperceptible smudge of smoke on the distant horizon stirred a flicker of something within her, not hope, precisely, but a primal pull towards human presence. It was the only direction she had. A small, desperate cluster of buildings, a town, rumored to be holding a ranchers' gathering. A place where men, if they were of means, might gather to trade horses, cattle, and sometimes, fate. The thought curdled in her stomach, bringing a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with hunger. What could she possibly offer? She had nothing of value, no dowry, no family name to carry. Only herself, a body weathered by hardship, a spirit fiercely clinging to survival. The desperation was a corrosive acid, eating away at her pride, stripping her down to the bare, undeniable fact of existence. She needed to live. More than that, she felt a burning, desperate need to not surrender, to spit in the eye of the forces that sought to extinguish her. As she walked, the sky, a vast, bruised canvas, began to bleed into shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, signaling the impending dusk. The cold deepened, seeping through her bones, making her teeth chatter uncontrollably. She pulled her shawl tighter, a futile gesture against the encroaching night. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe, morphing into imagined threats, wolves, desperate men, the ghosts of her own failures. Her internal monologue was a low, constant hum of fear and defiance. No. I will not break. Not yet. She repeated it like a mantra, a fragile shield against the encroaching darkness. She was not a small woman, her frame was tall, built for endurance, for the hard demands of frontier life. It was a strength she had once taken for granted, now her only asset. It was the strength that had seen her through the long nights of Thomas's fever, lifting him, changing his sweat-soaked linens, tending to him until the very last, agonizing breath. And it was the strength that would carry her, whether she liked it or not, to whatever miserable fate awaited her in that distant smudge of a town. The journey was not merely physical, it was a descent into the very core of her being, stripping away all but the raw, unyielding will to survive. The air tasted of ice and dust and the bitter tang of despair, yet with each painful step, a strange, grim determination solidified within her. She would face whatever came, head held high, if only to prove to herself that she was still, irrevocably, alive. The town, when she finally reached its outskirts, was nothing more than a few ramshackle buildings huddled together against the biting wind, its wooden structures groaning under the onslaught of the elements. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a few scattered residencies. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, stale beer, and horse manure, a familiar, if not comforting, aroma. Lanterns flickered in the windows, casting wavering pools of light onto the churned mud and frozen ruts of the main street. The sounds of raucous laughter and the mournful strains of a fiddle drifted from the saloon, a stark contrast to the deathly silence she had carried for weeks. It was a cacophony that assaulted her senses, a sudden, jarring reminder of human life, vibrant and oblivious to her silent suffering. She moved like a phantom, a creature of the dusk, her presence unnoticed amidst the bustle of a few men tending to horses outside the livery. Her gaze settled on the largest building, the saloon, from which the most light and sound emanated. This, she surmised, was where the ranchers would be, where decisions were made, where fortune shifted on the turn of a card or the heft of a handshake. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of dread and desperation. Her throat was dry, her tongue thick with fear. What she was about to do was an act of profound vulnerability, a stripping away of all dignity, yet the alternative was oblivion. The cold seeped through her thin boots, biting at her toes, a constant, physical reminder of the stakes. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the icy air burning in her lungs, and pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The saloon's interior was a haze of tobacco smoke and lamplight, a cacophony of voices, clinking glasses, and the rhythmic thump of boots on the wooden floor. The air was warm, almost oppressively so after the biting cold outside, and it prickled her chapped skin. Her eyes, accustomed to the gloom, struggled to adjust, watering in the thick, smoky atmosphere. All activity seemed to pause for a beat as she entered, a tall, gaunt figure silhouetted against the fading light of the doorway. Conversations died down, the fiddle's tune faltered, and a dozen pairs of eyes, hardened by years of sun and dust, turned to fix on her. They were men of the land, ranchers, cowboys, their faces etched with the lines of hard living, their bodies powerful and unyielding. They saw her, a woman alone, not as an equal, but as an anomaly, perhaps a vagrant, certainly a curiosity. A few snickers broke the silence, hushed whispers followed by the clink of glasses resuming. She forced herself to meet their stares, her chin lifting fractionally, a desperate attempt to project a strength she barely felt. Her hands, calloused and rough, unconsciously clutched the worn fabric of her shawl. The heat of their collective gaze was a tangible weight, pressing down on her, threatening to buckle her knees. She felt the fierce burn of shame, but beneath it, a colder, more insistent fire, the will to survive. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for an older man, a man of authority, someone who might listen. Her gaze snagged on a group gathered around a table in the corner, maps spread out, glasses of whiskey clutched in their hands. They looked like men of property, men who made decisions. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, then another, pushing through the dense air, each movement an effort of sheer will. The noise slowly built back up around her, but her focus remained on the men in the corner. Her heart hammered, a frantic drum against her ribs. She reached the table, her shadow falling across their faces, and they looked up, surprise etched on their weathered visages. One, a barrel-chested man with a thick, graying mustache, narrowed his eyes, a glint of suspicion in their depths. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked, his voice rough, laced with an unspoken challenge. Elara swallowed, her throat dry and constricted. The words she had rehearsed for miles, the words that felt like tearing out a piece of her soul, now seemed impossible to utter. But the alternative was starvation, oblivion. She thought of Thomas, of the life they had dreamed, of the children they had hoped for. A surge of fierce determination, born of grief and desperation, stiffened her spine. She met the rancher's gaze, her own eyes blazing with a raw, undeniable need. Her voice, when it came, was hoarse, but surprisingly clear, carrying over the din of the saloon. "Don't buy the horse," she said, her voice echoing the desolate wind outside. She paused, letting the words hang in the air, allowing their starkness to register. The room, once again, fell silent, every eye now fixed upon her, the sound of the fiddle dying out completely. "Don't buy the horse," she repeated, her voice gaining strength, tinged with a defiant desperation that cut through the haze of smoke and whiskey. She straightened her shoulders, pulling her tall frame to its full height, her posture one of challenge, not supplication. "Buy me, ranchers," her gaze swept over the men, unflinching, daring them to look away. "I'll bear you strong children." The words hung in the thick, smoky air, a raw, audacious declaration that shocked the room into stunned silence. A collective gasp, then a ripple of murmurs, hushed and disbelieving, swept through the saloon. Men exchanged glances, some with open derision, others with a flicker of uncomfortable understanding. The barrel-chested rancher's eyes widened, then narrowed into slits of wary amusement, a cruel smile beginning to form on his lips. "What in blazes, woman," he scoffed, pushing back his chair, ready to dismiss her, to laugh her out of the room. "Are you mad? This ain't no flesh market." Elara stood her ground, her gaze unwavering, even as the shame burned a furious path up her neck and cheeks. Her offer was audacious, yes, but born of a profound and utterly stark necessity. She was not a harlot, her plea was not for fleeting pleasure, but for life, for purpose, for a chance to etch her existence onto this unforgiving land. "I am not mad, sir," she stated, her voice trembling slightly but holding firm. "I am a widow, with no land, no coin, and no kin. My husband, Thomas, died of the fever 3 weeks past. The bank took our claim." She gestured vaguely to the west, to the invisible scars of her past. "I am strong. I am tall. I have worked a man's plot from dawn until dusk. I can cook, mend, tend livestock. And I can bear children. Strong children, like my mother bore, and her mother before her. Children to work the land, to carry your name, to build your legacy." Her words, though direct, were imbued with a desperate dignity, a testament to her enduring spirit. The rancher, caught off guard by her earnestness and the stark reality of her situation, hesitated, his scoff dying on his lips. The room remained hushed, the silence now heavy with an uncomfortable tension. It was an offer both shocking and, in the brutal practicality of the frontier, not entirely unheard of, albeit usually made through intermediaries or in hushed, private conversations. To declare it so openly, so fiercely, was an act of both ultimate vulnerability and astonishing courage. Then, from the shadows at a smaller, isolated table, a voice cut through the stillness. It was low, gravelly, and entirely devoid of the mocking tone of the other men. "She speaks truth. A woman alone out here, with no coin, it's a death sentence." All eyes turned to the speaker. He was a man of the mountains and the high plains, not the neatly trimmed ranchers. His face was weathered, deeply tanned, with eyes that seemed to hold the vast, unblinking wisdom of the land itself. A faded blue bandana was tied loosely around his neck, and his worn leather coat spoke of countless miles under an open sky. He was Caleb, a man known for his solitary existence, his uncanny skill with horses, and his ranch, rumored to be situated so far into the wilderness that only a fool or a hermit would choose to live there. He had entered the saloon quietly, unnoticed, and had been observing Elara since her entrance. The barrel-chested rancher, Jedediah Thorne, scoffed. "And what business is it of yours, Caleb? You're hardly one for a family life." Caleb ignored him, his gaze fixed on Elara. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, were intense, searching, but devoid of judgment. "What's your name, woman?" he asked, his voice flat, yet carrying a surprising resonance. "Elara," she replied, her voice a little steadier now, finding a strange anchor in his calm, unyielding presence. "Elara," he repeated, a slight nod of his head. "You want to live? You want to work? You want to build something that lasts?" She met his gaze, a desperate hope flickering within her, battling with an ingrained caution. "Yes," she breathed, the single word carrying the weight of her entire being. "I need hands on my ranch," Caleb continued, his eyes unwavering. "Hard hands. My spread is far. Hard work. No frills. And if you speak of strong children, I have no heir. No one to pass my land to when my time comes. He paused, allowing his words to sink in. It's a bargain, then. Your strength, your promise, for a roof, food, and a future. No more, no less. His offer was as stark and unadorned as the landscape he inhabited, a proposition stripped bare of sentiment, yet carrying a profound gravity. It was a business deal, a transaction of survival and legacy, yet his steady gaze held a curious absence of malice or crude exploitation, only a pragmatic assessment. Jedediah Thorne laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. You take on a woman, Caleb? You, who can barely tolerate a stray dog for company. Caleb merely turned his storm-cloud eyes on Thorne, a silent, almost imperceptible challenge that quelled the rancher's derision. Then he looked back at Ilara. Well, Ilara, he prompted, his voice calm, giving her the choice, the power of decision. He wasn't demanding, he was offering a path. Ilara's mind reeled. It was a bizarre, unexpected turn. This man, Caleb, an enigma, known for his isolation, was offering her a future. It was not a romantic rescue, but a stark, utilitarian agreement. Yet, in his eyes, she saw not lust or scorn, but a peculiar kind of respect for her desperation, for her unvarnished truth. It was a chance, however unconventional, however frightening, to escape the abyss. To build, to earn, to exist. She looked around the room, at the lingering stares, the whispers, and then back at Caleb, his face impassive, waiting. The alternative was a return to the wind-whipped plains, to the certainty of starvation and death. Her chin lifted again, higher this time, not in defiance, but in a burgeoning sense of purpose. I accept, she said, her voice firm, resolute. It was not a capitulation, but a reclamation of her agency, a desperate grasp at the reins of her own fate. A strange quiet settled over the room once more, a tension that had transformed from derision to a grudging respect, or perhaps, simply stunned silence. Caleb gave a curt nod. Then we leave at first light, he said, rising from his table. There's a room above the livery. The stable hand will show you. He left no room for further discussion, no opportunity for doubt. He turned and walked out of the saloon, his silhouette briefly framed in the doorway before disappearing into the night, leaving Ilara alone amidst the stunned onlookers, bound to a silent, solitary man and a future as wild and untamed as the land itself. The bargain was struck, not with a handshake, but with a silent understanding forged in the crucible of her desperate plea. The journey to Caleb's ranch was a testament to his words, hard work, no frills for 2 days. They rode in near silence, the only sounds the creak of saddle leather, the rhythmic thud of horses' hooves on frozen ground, and the incessant whisper of the wind. Ilara rode a sturdy, dun-colored mare, borrowed from the livery, its gait steady beneath her. Caleb, on a powerful black stallion, rode a few lengths ahead, his back a rigid, uncommunicative line. His presence was a solid, unyielding force, a silent sentinel against the vast emptiness of the plains. He offered no conversation, no reassurances, only terse directions and the occasional, almost imperceptible glance over his shoulder to ensure she was keeping pace. Ilara, for her part, welcomed the quiet. It allowed her mind to wrestle with the enormity of her decision, to process the raw truth of her circumstances. The shame of her public declaration still burned, a dull ache beneath her ribs, but it was slowly being eclipsed by a burgeoning sense of defiant self-preservation. She was no longer a victim, she was a survivor. She had made a choice, however stark, and she would see it through. Her gaze often drifted to Caleb's back, trying to glean some insight into the man who had, with such detached pragmatism, offered her a lifeline. He was an enigma, his movements precise and efficient, his face a landscape of hard-won experience. What kind of man lived so far from others? What drove him to make such an offer? Questions swirled in her mind, unanswered, as vast and open as the plains around them. The landscape grew wilder, the gentle undulations of the plains giving way to more rugged terrain, scattered with ancient, wind-gnarled junipers and outcrops of dark, craggy rock. The sky remained a vast, indifferent canvas, shifting from the harsh brilliance of day to the velvet blackness of night, studded with an unbelievable profusion of stars. They made camp by small, frozen creeks, where Caleb, with practiced ease, built a fire that crackled and spit, chasing away the bone-deep chill. He shared his meager provisions, hardtack, dried meat, strong coffee, without ceremony, pushing them towards her with a silent gesture. There was no warmth in his manner, no comforting words, yet there was no unkindness either. Only a stark, almost brutal, honesty. He treated her as a competent adult, an equal in the face of the harsh wilderness, not as a fragile woman needing protection. This was, paradoxically, a relief. During those long, cold nights by the fire, Elara would observe him as he tended to the horses, or simply stared into the flames, his profile etched against the flickering light. His features were rugged, his jawline strong, a faint scar visible above his left eyebrow. His hands, like hers, were calloused, strong, the hands of a man who worked the land, who lived by his wits and his labor. He rarely met her gaze, but she felt his silent assessment, a constant, unobtrusive weighing of her presence, her capabilities. She, in turn, sought to understand him, to unravel the mystery of the man who had taken her in. She wondered about his past, about the reasons for his solitude. Had he known loss? Had he been betrayed? The questions remained suspended in the crisp night air, unasked, unanswered. By the second afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, Caleb raised a hand, pointing towards a distant, almost imperceptible collection of structures nestled in a shallow valley. There, he said, his voice curt. The ranch, and Elara's eyes followed his gaze, and she saw it, a small, sturdy cabin built of rough-hewn logs, a corral, a barn, and a smokehouse, all dwarfed by the immense, rolling hills that surrounded them. It was not a grand estate, not even a comfortable farmstead, but it looked solid, enduring, as if it had grown organically from the very earth itself. A thin wisp of smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a welcoming sign of life in the vast emptiness. As they approached, a pack of lean, shaggy dogs, their coats the color of dust and shadows, erupted from the cabin, barking furiously. Caleb merely whistled, a low, piercing sound that cut through the noise, and the dogs immediately fell silent, their tails wagging tentatively as they approached him, sniffing at his boots. They eyed Elara with suspicion, their hackles raised, but Caleb's calm presence kept them at bay. It was a clear demonstration of his authority, his command over his small domain. The cabin itself was small, one main room dominated by a large stone fireplace, and a small sleeping loft above. The air inside was warm, smelling of pine smoke and something else, something distinctly masculine, leather, pipe tobacco, and the faint, earthy scent of the land. It was sparse, but clean and functional. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a bedroll on the floor beneath the loft. "Your bed is up there," Caleb said, gesturing towards the loft with a tilt of his head. "Mind the ladder." He then pointed to a corner of the main room. "Water barrel. Firewood by the door. Kitchen is what it is. You cook." His instructions were direct, leaving no room for ambiguity. Elara nodded, her eye scanning the small space, taking in every detail. It was primitive, yes, but it was a roof over her head, a sanctuary from the relentless wind and cold. And it was hers, at least in part, by virtue of their strange, unspoken agreement. She climbed the ladder to the loft, the rough-hewn wood biting into her palms. The space was small, barely enough room for a bedroll, but there was a window, looking out over the desolate landscape. It was a place of her own, a space to breathe, to simply be. As she settled her meager belongings, the exhaustion of the journey finally caught up to her, a bone-deep weariness that threatened to consume her. Later, as the last light bled from the sky, Elara descended, finding Caleb stoking the fire, his back to her. The dogs had settled near the hearth, their eyes glinting in the firelight. The silence stretched between them, comfortable yet charged. "There's flour, salt pork, some dried beans," he said, without turning, anticipating her next move. "Make something." His voice was devoid of emotion, a simple statement of fact, of expectation. And Elara, for the first time in weeks, felt a faint stir of purpose, a small spark igniting within the embers of her despair. She was here now. And she would work. She would prove her worth, not just to Caleb, but to herself, to the memory of Thomas, to the unforgiving land that had once threatened to swallow her whole. The bargain had begun. The rhythm of life on Caleb's ranch settled into a relentless, physically demanding routine. Ilara awoke before dawn, the chill of the unheated loft biting at her, and descended to coax the embers of the previous night's fire back to life. Her days were a blur of motion, hauling water from the well, chopping firewood, mending clothes, both her own and Caleb's, with careful, precise stitches, preparing meals from their limited provisions, and tending to the small herd of cattle and horses. Her hands, already calloused, grew rougher, her muscles ached with a persistent, deep burn, but with each passing day, a quiet strength settled into her bones, replacing the brittle vulnerability that had once defined her. Caleb, true to his nature, remained a man of few words. His presence was a constant, almost elemental force, always working, always moving. He taught her, through silent demonstration or a terse, one-word instruction, how to repair a fence post, how to saddle a horse with greater efficiency, how to recognize the subtle signs of illness in a calf. He expected competence, not gratitude, and Ilara, in turn, offered her diligence and her burgeoning skill. There were no pleasantries, no shared stories around the evening fire, only the quiet sounds of their movements, the crackle of the flames, and the mournful howl of the wind outside. Yet, in this silence, a strange understanding began to form between them. She watched him, observing the economy of his movements, the quiet authority he held over his animals, the way his eyes, sharp and discerning, scanned the horizon for any sign of change, of threat. He was a creature of this land, as wild and unyielding as the hills around them, but there was a deep current of integrity within him, an unspoken code that governed his actions. He was not cruel, not dismissive, simply remote. He honored their bargain not with sentiment, but with solid, unwavering provision. She had a roof, food, and purpose. It was not a life of ease, but it was life. One frigid morning, as Ilara was struggling to split a particularly knotty log, her axe glancing off the wood with a frustrated thud, Caleb appeared beside her, his presence silent and unexpected. Without a word, he took the axe from her hands. His movements were fluid, powerful. He brought the blade down with a clean, precise strike, splitting the log in two with effortless grace. He handed the axe back, his eyes meeting hers for a fleeting moment. There was no admonishment, no instruction, just a silent demonstration of skill, a subtle offering of assistance. A warmth, not from the fire, spread through Ilara's chest. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, yet it spoke volumes. It was a recognition of her effort, a quiet acknowledgement of her struggle, and a hint of the strength he possessed. She began to notice other small details. When the wind was particularly fierce, he would ensure the cabin's windows were tightly latched. When she coughed, raspy from the cold, he would leave a tin of herbal tea on the table, still warm from the fire. These were not grand gestures of affection, but practical acts of care, woven into the fabric of their silent existence. They were the threads that began to knit together their tenuous connection, transforming it from a raw transaction into something akin to a partnership. Ilara, who had braced herself for crude demands or dismissive indifference, found instead a quiet respect that, in its own way, was far more profound. The harshness of the environment became a character in itself, shaping them, testing them. Winter descended with a vengeance, burying the ranch under a blanket of pristine, unforgiving snow. The cold was a constant companion, forcing them to huddle closer to the fire, their breath pluming even indoors. During the blizzards, they were isolated, cut off from the outside world, their existence pared down to the most elemental needs, warmth, food, survival. It was during these times that Ilara's inner resilience truly blossomed. She learned to mend torn feed sacks, to identify herbs for medicine, to nurse a sick calf back to health with unwavering patience. Her movements became more confident, her decisions sharper, her understanding of the land deeper. One evening, as a fierce blizzard raged outside, trapping them indoors, Ilara sat mending Caleb's heavy winter coat, her needles flashing in the lamplight. Caleb sat across from her, cleaning his rifle, the methodical click of the mechanism the only sound save for the howling wind. She found herself speaking, her voice quiet in the vastness of the room. "My mother always said I was built for this life. Tall, strong, she'd say. Not like the delicate flowers in town. A faint, almost imperceptible curve touched the corner of Caleb's mouth. It was not a smile, but a softening of his hard features, a fleeting acknowledgement of her words. He continued cleaning his rifle, but the air felt less heavy, less silent. It was a small crack in the wall of his reserve, a fragile invitation for her to share a piece of herself. Emboldened, she continued, speaking of her childhood on her family's small farm, of her parents, hard-working and kind, and of Thomas, her husband. She spoke of their dreams for their own piece of land, their plans for a family, their quiet hopes. Her voice, initially hesitant, grew steadier, filling the cabin with echoes of a life that was now irrevocably lost, yet still a part of her. Caleb listened, his movement slow and deliberate, his gaze fixed on his rifle, yet Ilara felt his attention, a deep, silent absorption of her narrative. He offered no platitudes, no empty words of comfort, but his stillness, his unwavering presence, was a profound solace. It was the first time she had truly spoken of her grief, her losses, since Thomas's passing, and in the quiet acceptance of Caleb's listening, some of the tightness in her chest began to ease. When she finished, the cabin was silent once more, save for the wind's howl. Caleb finally looked up, his storm cloud eyes meeting hers. "Hard to lose what you've built," he said, his voice low, raspy. It was not a question, but a statement of shared understanding. And in those few words, Ilara sensed his own history, his own losses, buried deep beneath layers of silence and solitude. The bargain had begun as a desperate exchange of needs, but it was slowly, tentatively, evolving into something more profound, a quiet alliance forged in the crucible of shared hardship and unspoken empathy, a silent agreement to face the unforgiving world, together. As weeks turned into months, Ilara's presence became an indispensable part of the ranch, not merely a necessary hand, but a vital force. The cabin, once dark and singularly masculine, now held faint traces of her touch, a patch of wildflowers dried and hung from a beam, a small, polished stone placed on the mantelpiece, the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread. Her silent contributions had softened the edges of their existence, turning a survival camp into something closer to a home. Caleb, while still a man of few words, had subtly shifted. His eyes, once unreadable, now held a flicker of something akin to contentment when she brought him a steaming mug of coffee on a cold morning, or when he found a fresh shirt, neatly mended, laid out for him. Ilara's own transformation was profound. The gaunt, fear-haunted widow of the saloon was gone, replaced by a woman whose shoulders were straighter, whose gaze was steadier, whose hands, though still scarred, moved with confident purpose. She had faced her deepest fears, laid bare her most desperate needs, and emerged not broken, but forged anew. The grief for Thomas still resided within her, a quiet ache, but it no longer consumed her. It had become a part of her strength, a reminder of what she had endured and overcome. She was no longer waiting for life to happen to her, she was actively, fiercely, building it. One crisp spring morning, as the first green shoots began to tentatively unfurl on the hillsides, a shadow fell across their fragile peace. Caleb had ridden into town for supplies, a rare trip he usually made alone. This time, Ilara insisted on accompanying him, her reasons vague, a feeling of unease stirring within her. The town was as harsh as she remembered, the stares still present, though now tinged with curiosity rather than derision. As they loaded sacks of flour and coffee into their wagon, a man approached them, his face a mask of oily politeness that did not reach his cold eyes. He was Jedediah Thorne, the rancher who had scoffed at her desperate plea. He was not alone, 2 other men, rough-looking and heavily armed, flanked him. "Caleb," Thorne began, his voice dripping with false cordiality, "heard you've been doing well out there. Your land, prime grazing for my herds. And your water source, well, that's a rarity this far out." He gestured with a dismissive wave towards the wagon. "I'm offering to buy you out. A fair price, of course." Caleb's face remained impassive, his eyes narrowed, his hand unconsciously dropping to the worn butt of his revolver. "My land isn't for sale, Thorne. Never has been." Thorne's smile tightened, his voice losing its veneer of politeness. "Now, Caleb, don't be foolish. You're a solitary man. What good is all that land to you? It's a lot to defend, all alone. And with company now, he glanced pointedly at Ilara, a sneer twisting his lips. You do well to consider the implications. His gaze lingered on Ilara, a predatory gleam in his eyes, implying a threat that went beyond property. Ilara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach, but she did not flinch. She met Thorn's gaze, her chin lifting defiantly. She was no longer the desperate, vulnerable woman begging for survival. She was a woman who had found her footing, her purpose, and she would not be easily intimidated. Caleb stepped forward, placing himself subtly between Thorn and Ilara. "She's not alone," he said, his voice low, dangerous, a rumble like distant thunder. "And neither am I. We've built something here, Thorn. We'll keep it." Thorn's men shifted, their hands hovering near their own weapons. The tension in the dusty street was palpable, taut as a stretched wire. "A shame, Caleb," Thorn drawled, his voice a mocking purr. "A great shame. This land has a way of sorting itself out. Things happen." Accidents, he winked, a chilling gesture that sent a shiver down Ilara's spine. "You think on it?" Before something regrettable occurs. With a final, taunting glance at Ilara, Thorn and his men mounted their horses and rode away, leaving behind a silence that was heavier, more ominous than any overt threat. The drive back to the ranch was filled with a new kind of silence, charged with unspoken danger. Ilara kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, her mind racing. Thorn's words, his predatory gaze, had shaken her, but they had also ignited a fierce protectiveness, a resolve she hadn't known she possessed. This was their land, their life. She had fought too hard to claim it, to build it, to simply surrender. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Caleb, for the first time, spoke at length. He laid out the history of his claim, of Thorn's previous attempts to encroach on his land, his desire for the water source and prime grazing. "He'll not give up," Caleb said, staring into the flames. "He's a man who takes what he wants. By force, if necessary." Ilara listened, her heart pounding, but her resolve hardening. "Then we'll fight him," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. "This is our home, Caleb. My home. I won't let him take it." Her declaration was not a plea for reassurance, but a statement of intent, a warrior's vow. Caleb looked at her, his storm cloud eyes holding a flicker of surprise, then a slow, almost imperceptible nod of approval. In that moment, the bargain, the unspoken agreement, solidified into something far more profound than survival. It became a shared commitment to defend their future, together. The quiet partnership had found its purpose, its test. The threat from Jedediah Thorn loomed over them like a gathering storm, a palpable tension that sharpened Ilara's senses and hardened her resolve. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden danger, every distant dust cloud a potential harbinger of Thorn's return. Caleb, ever vigilant, redoubled his efforts, scouting the perimeter of their land daily, his rifle always within reach. Ilara, no longer content to simply manage the homestead, insisted on learning how to handle a rifle herself, her hands, once accustomed to needles and the weight of bread dough, now wrapping around the cold steel with determined concentration. Caleb, without a word of protest, showed her how to load, aim, and fire, his instructions terse but precise. Her shots, initially wild and uncertain, grew steadily more accurate, a testament to her fierce will to defend what she had finally found. Days bled into weeks, each one a test of their patience, their readiness. They worked side by side, silent partners in their defense. Ilara felt a strange sense of exhilaration, a grim satisfaction in facing this new challenge. It was a tangible enemy, something to fight against, rather than the formless despair that had once threatened to consume her. This fight, however terrifying, was a validation of her strength, her purpose. The confrontation came, not with a grand assault, but with a cunning, cruel act. One morning, they awoke to find several of their cattle slaughtered, their bodies left as a gruesome message, their throats slit, a stark warning carved into the ground nearby. Leave the sight filled Ilara with a cold fury she hadn't known she possessed. These animals were their livelihood, their future. This was not merely theft, it was an act of brutal intimidation. Caleb's face, usually impassive, was a mask of grim determination, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark with rage. "He's making his move," he said, his voice a low growl. He wants to starve us out. But Ilara was not easily broken. She looked at the dead cattle, then at Caleb, her eyes blazing with an unyielding resolve. He won't, she declared, her voice firm. We'll bury them. We'll reinforce the fences. We'll be ready, and so they did. They worked tirelessly, their bodies aching, their grief for the lost animals overshadowed by a fierce, protective anger. The act of burial, of covering the raw wounds in the earth, became an act of defiance, a silent vow that they would not be driven off. The next day, Thorn himself appeared, not on their land, but on a ridge overlooking their ranch, a silhouette against the harsh glare of the midday sun. With him were a dozen riders, their figures stark against the sky. They rode slowly, deliberately, along the boundary line of Caleb's property, their presence a menacing declaration. They made no direct move, no overt attack, but their message was clear: we are here. We are watching. We will take what is ours. Caleb stood by the cabin, his rifle cradled in his arms, his gaze fixed on the riders. Ilara stood beside him, her own rifle clutched tightly, its weight a comforting presence in her hands. She felt no fear, only a cold, burning resolve. She was no longer just a woman alone, she was a partner, a defender of their home. She met Caleb's gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. They would not break. They would not run. The standoff lasted for hours. The sun beat down, the wind whipped dust around them, and the distant figures on the ridge remained, unmoving, watching. It was a war of nerves, a silent battle of wills. Ilara felt the tension coil in her stomach, but she held firm, her gaze as unwavering as Caleb's. She understood now that this was not just about land or resources, it was about pride, about dominance, about the very right to exist. As the sun began to dip towards the western horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the land, a single rider detached himself from Thorn's group. It was Thorn himself. He rode slowly, deliberately, down the slope, stopping 100 yards from the cabin. Caleb, he bellowed, his voice carrying on the wind, a harsh, challenging sound. This is your last chance. Ride out now, and no more blood will be shed. Caleb raised his rifle, not aiming, but holding it steady, a clear sign of his readiness. Ilara, beside him, mirrored his stance, her own rifle held firm. Thorn paused, his eye sweeping over them, taking in Ilara's unyielding posture, her determined gaze. He had expected to find a lone, broken man, perhaps a frightened woman. Instead, he saw two figures, standing as one, their combined presence a formidable barrier. You've made your choice, then? Thorn shouted, a frustrated anger creeping into his voice. He made a gesture to his men on the ridge, and for a terrifying moment, Ilara thought they would charge. But then, Thorn hesitated. He saw the unyielding resolve in Caleb's eyes, the fierce determination in Ilara's. He saw two people prepared to die for their land, and in their unity, he recognized a force that would be costly, perhaps even impossible, to overcome. He was a bully, accustomed to easy victories, and this was not one. With a final, frustrated curse, Thorn turned his horse and galloped back up the ridge to his men. For a moment, they remained there, a dark tableau against the setting sun, and then, as one, they turned their horses and rode away, disappearing over the horizon, leaving behind only the dust and the vast, empty silence. The tension slowly drained from Ilara, leaving her weak-kneed and trembling, but also filled with a strange, fierce triumph. They had stood their ground. They had won. She lowered her rifle, her gaze still fixed on the empty horizon where Thorn had vanished. Caleb, too, lowered his rifle. He turned to her, his eyes, usually so guarded, holding a flicker of something akin to pride, and perhaps, a deeper emotion she could not yet name. He did not speak, but he reached out, his calloused hand briefly covering hers, a silent acknowledgement of their shared victory, their unbreakable bond. The bargain had proven its worth, it had forged them into something stronger, something unified, capable of facing down any threat that the unforgiving land, or its greedy inhabitants, might throw at them. The aftermath of Thorn's retreat settled over the ranch, a quiet calm after the storm, but it was a different kind of calm. The air no longer hummed with the electric tension of imminent threat, instead, it carried the gentle hum of peace, earned through courage and defiance. The land, once a canvas for their struggle, now felt like a silent witness to their victory, bathed in the soft, forgiving light of a spring evening. Ilara felt an profound exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness that settled into her muscles, but beneath it, a soaring sense of triumph, a quiet pride. She had faced down a tangible threat, not with a plea, but with a rifle in her hands and an unyielding will in her heart. Caleb built a larger fire that evening, its flames licking high into the cold air, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. There was no boisterous celebration, no shouted cheers, only a shared meal eaten in a silence that felt entirely new. It was a silence imbued with mutual respect, a deep understanding that had grown from shared hardship and shared victory. Ilara found herself watching Caleb more openly, her gaze lingering on his strong profile, the quiet strength in his eyes. He, too, seemed less guarded, his posture more relaxed, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Later, as they sat by the fire, the dogs curled at their feet, Caleb finally spoke, his voice low, almost a murmur, barely audible above the crackle of the flames. "You stood firm," he said, his gaze fixed on the dancing firelight, but his words clearly directed at her. "Many would have run." Ilara looked at him, her heart swelling with a complex mix of emotions. "I had nowhere left to run," she confessed, her voice soft. "And this place, it became my home. My fight." She paused, then continued, a quiet honesty in her tone. "When I stood in that saloon, Caleb, I was broken. Desperate. I offered what I thought I had left to offer, my strength, my potential for new life. To be bought, in essence." A faint blush crept up her neck, but she met his gaze, unflinching. "But you didn't buy me. You gave me a chance. A chance to build, to earn my place." She gestured around the small cabin, to the warmth, the safety. "You gave me a life, Caleb. And a reason to fight for it." Caleb turned his head, his storm cloud eyes meeting hers, and in their depths, Ilara saw a profound depth of feeling she had never witnessed before. There was no pity, no condescension, only a raw, unspoken understanding. He didn't deny her words, didn't offer false reassurances. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "We built it," he corrected, his voice raspy, his gaze steady. "Together." His simple words carried the weight of 100 unsaid declarations, a quiet acknowledgement of their partnership, their shared journey. It was a profound shift, a transformation of their utilitarian bargain into something far more intimate, far more human. The very foundation of their agreement, once rooted in desperation, was now firmly planted in mutual respect and a burgeoning, undeniable connection. That night, as Ilara lay in her loft, the sounds of the ranch settling around her, she reflected on the woman she had become. The ghost of Thomas still whispered in her memory, but it was no longer a lament. It was a quiet strength, a reminder of the love that had shaped her, the loss that had broken her, and the resilience that had rebuilt her. She was no longer defined by what she had lost, but by what she had found, her own inner fortitude, a sense of belonging, and a quiet, steadfast companion in Caleb. She thought of her desperate plea in the saloon, the offer to bear strong children. At the time, it had been a raw, primal cry for survival, a commodity she was willing to trade for existence. Now, the prospect felt different. It was no longer a desperate bargain, but a shared possibility, a future built on mutual understanding, honor and trust. The idea no longer carried the sting of shame, but the quiet warmth of hope, a potential for legacy that transcended mere transaction. The next morning, the ranch was alive with the promise of spring. The sun rose, painting the eastern sky in hues of gold and rose, casting a warm light over the hills. Ilara descended the ladder, her steps lighter, her heart feeling less burdened. Caleb was already up, tending to the fire, the smell of coffee filling the cabin. He looked up as she entered, and for the first time, Ilara saw a genuine, albeit small, smile grace his lips, a softening that transformed his rugged features. It was not a grand, sweeping gesture, but a subtle, tender acknowledgement of their new dawn, their shared future. He handed her a steaming mug of coffee, their fingers brushing for a brief, electric moment. "There's a new foal in the south pasture," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Born just before dawn. Ilara's eyes widened, a joyous light filling them. A new life. A symbol of resilience, of continuation. She looked at Caleb, then out the window towards the brightening horizon, a quiet hope blooming in her chest. The path ahead would still be hard, the land still unforgiving, but she would not face it alone. She had found her place, not as a bought commodity, but as a partner, a builder, a woman who had offered her strength and found something infinitely more valuable in return, a quiet dignity, an unbreakable spirit, and a shared future on the high plains. The journey had stripped her bare, but in doing so, it had revealed the formidable strength of her own heart, ready to embrace whatever the horizon might bring. Together,